Prithvi Shantirantarikshagam Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamayam Tamasoma Jyotirgamayam Mrityorma Amritam Gamayam Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We begin today the new section on non-duality in practice, starting with verse 265. Up to this point, we have seen in this book the 5 layers over the Atman, called the Panchakoshas. We also saw the 3 kinds of bodies. In other words, the different ways how the Atman is covered gets described in the early part of the book. Then we also saw how to analyze the Upanishadic teaching, Tat Tvamasi, thou art that, you are that. What does you mean here? What is that? And how these two, the finite being and the infinite reality, how they can be one and the same. And in that context, we saw the difference between the literal meaning and the implied meaning. That if something doesn't make sense literally, if we know that it has come from a trusted source, we then need to look deeply into that statement and find whether there is an implied meaning involved there. And here we then, that meaning of Tattvamasi, or you are that, was analyzed to show how this apparently finite being and this infinite being can be one and the same if we apply the rules of implications or understand it in that way. It would make complete sense. So now, up to this point, whatever we saw may have been very intellectually stimulating. It might have even made complete sense logically. But the purpose of this book is not simply intellectual satisfaction, not simply to make us feel good about it, or not just kind of an exercise in logical thinking. All of that is true. It is intellectually stimulating, it is very logical, and all of that. That's very true. But the purpose is where, as they say, the rubber hits the road, is, can I put it into practice? Can I live according to this way of thinking? Because if we don't, then our intellectual life will remain at one level or go in one direction, and our day-to-day life will go in a different direction. And sometimes that does happen. That, and not just with spiritual life. Sometimes people might be interested, say, in reading literature. Someone is interested in fantasy books, for instance. So their mind may be in some fantasy world, deriving a lot of meaning and fulfillment there. But that fantasy world in which the mind finds its fulfillment and joy may have no connection with the day-to-day grind of the day-to-day life. And that's how our life kind of gets divided. And in some ways, if we think, our life has already gotten a lot of divided. In fact, it seems like a good way to organize our life in some way. People have their work email and their personal email, or they have several different calendars, or this is my work-related calendar, this is the calendar for my family, this is for my personal thing, this is for this. So it seems and can be very helpful to kind of have things categorized and compartmentalized that way. And that's great. While it can be helpful at one level, at a very subtle level, our life does get divided. So sometimes they say that we have as many distinct selves as the distinct social circles in which we move. And we might have a very different persona in those circles. So when a person comes home, the way they deal with their family and the kind of personality they are, they may be a very different person oftentimes in their work environment, because the people they are dealing with are different people. The personality equations are very different at your workplace than at home. And so we might think that this is natural for me to be doing things differently at workplace and differently at home. And that's completely understandable. While I could, and I need to, I should do things appropriate to the place, to the context, to the people we are dealing with. At the same time, it's the same person. The person is not different. When I go to the office, when I go home, when I go to watch a movie, when I go to watch a game, when I go shopping, I'm still the same person. So while recognizing the different places and contexts and the different work and the different people that we live and work with in our life, we need to find a way to somehow affirm that person, the real person inside, who is moving in all these different locations. And who is that real person? And sometimes we might find, if we have not thought deeply into it, there is no real person. And so that is when our life becomes very superficial. That I try to be everything to every person. I try to do everything appropriate to time, place, but there is no, where am I rooted? What is my identity? In spite of all of these superficial, external, temporary changes that might occur, is there anything unchanging within me? And what is that unchanging within me? Now, at one level we could say, and at the kind of most basic level would be, wherever I am, I'm a human being. Whether I'm at home, whether I'm at workplace, and in different contexts, different times, different people, I'm still a human being. And that's good. So there is one identity I think all human beings probably have effortlessly, is that in spite of all these other changes in our lives on a day-to-day basis, I continue to remain a human being always. Now, if that's all that I want, we don't need to read this book at all. But what this book is pointing us to is that, yes, that's my present identity, apparently a very stable identity, no matter where I am or what I'm doing. But up to this point, what we have seen in this book is that that's not my true identity. That identity is a very superficial identity. A dog has a dog identity, because that being inside the dog has a dog body. I have a human identity because the being inside this has a human form. Now this human form came into being the moment I was born, and this human form will disappear when I die, when the body is just reduced to a heap of dust or heap of ashes. So what was my identity before I became a human being? What will be my identity after my humanness ends with death? What is that identity which is not dependent on birth and death? And that we have seen up to this point is the Atman, which is not a material entity. The body and the mind are very material, but that my true identity is non-material. The question is, in the course of the day, how often do I become aware of this real, inner, deeper identity of mine? It's not like we have to keep on reminding ourselves, oh, I'm a human being, I'm a human being. Whether or not we do that, we know deep down, it's a firm reality right now, is that I'm a human being. If some person wakes up one fine morning and says, I'm a cat or I'm a lion, people think something is wrong with that person. But if you say, I'm a human being, they'll say, why do you need to say it? We all know you're a human being, right? But right now, because we have gotten this way of thinking that I'm a human being, we need to find a way to remind ourselves that I'm a divine being, that I'm not limited to this body, mind, ego, that the true me, the real me, is non-perishable. The real me was never born, will never die. The real me never falls sick. The real me never ages. The real me is always fresh, always new. The real me is infinite, immortal. And how long should we keep on reminding ourselves of this? We should keep on reminding ourselves of this until this false conviction that we have, the false identity that we have that I'm a human being, disappears. So as naturally as I know myself to be a human being now, when I know with equal ease, equal effortlessness that I am the Atman, then I'm enlightened. So now we know kind of where we are and where we need to go. And that's the section we are going to do now. Non-duality in practice. So non-duality, the intellectual background for it we have seen. But what does it mean to live like this? And that's what will be discussed now. So let's begin with verse 265. Swambodhamatram parishuddha tattvam vijnaya sankhe nrupavaccha sainye tadatmanaivatmani sarvada sthito vilapaya brahmani vishvajatam. Recognizing the self in the body and mind, like the king in an army, to be only pure awareness and remaining always absorbed in that awareness, merge this universe in Brahman. That's pretty straightforward. The self in the body and mind, the Atman, is like the king in an army. Now, the army has many soldiers, hundreds of them, thousands. But the king is always one. The commander-in-chief is always one. Exactly in the same way, the Atman is just one. And the army of the Atman, if you like, if you want to push that analogy further, is just the body and the mind, then you could say, well, the different organs in the body, the different parts of the mind, every nerve that we have, every artery, every cell in the body is like a soldier, if you like, if you want to push that analogy further. But the Atman is one. So recognizing that one king, the one true commander, everyone is dependent on the king. In the olden days, if the king is killed in a battle, that kingdom is lost. The enemy comes and takes over. As long as and that's why there was all this, the focus was always to keep the king safe. I mean, even in the game of chess, you can keep on killing all other, what do you call those, each of those, any chess players here? Pawns and, all the different, the bishop, the rook and all those different characters that are there in the game. You can all of them can die. But the game ends only when the king is attacked and the king has nowhere else to go. So, exactly in the same way, the Atman is the most important entity within us. So, recognizing the Atman to be pure awareness, non-material, and this is most important, remaining always absorbed in that awareness. And how do we do that? Merging this universe in Brahman. Now what it means, how do you merge? Sometimes when we think about merging, it just feels as if there are two entities. There is this universe and there is the Brahman. You merge the universe in Brahman. But the point is there are really no two entities. So it's like merge the snake in the rope. How do you merge the snake in the rope? You merge the snake in the rope by simply, you are seeing the snake, but looking at the snake and saying, you're not real. That the real is behind you. The rope is the real one. And so even when you see the snake and then you look at the rope and say, that is the reality. That's how the snake gets merged in the rope. Not physically, because they are not two separate physical entities. It means that the snake is only an appearance. The snake has no existence independent of the rope. So if you think about it this way, the idea is, here the universe is in place of the rope, in place of the snake, and Brahman or the Atman, they are interchangeable, is in the place of the rope. So when you say merge the snake in the rope or merge the universe in Brahman, what it really means is the universe that I am experiencing day by day, moment by moment, I should always be aware that this universe has no existence independent of Brahman, just as the snake has no existence independent of the rope. What makes the wave in an ocean exist is a certain portion of water acquires a certain form and then we call it a wave. Just we give it a name to a portion of a water which is taken some form and is moving in a certain way. We say that's a wave. Now that wave is really nothing but the water of the ocean. But as long as that form and that name remain, it seems to have an independent existence. But you cannot really take a wave out of the ocean and say this is the wave and this is the ocean, because it's just the same water. And once the name and the form of that wave disappears, the wave disappears. So if I can take the name and form out of that water which looks like a wave, it's found to be nothing but the ocean. Exactly in the same way, if I can take the name and form out of every object in this universe, it will be nothing but Brahman. As I sometimes like to say, that my eyes are closed, I'm not seeing anything. When my eyes open and I suddenly see this colorful scene in front of me, where there are chairs, objects, people, I see all of that. Each and everything I see before me, living and non-living, has a form and has a name. Now, think about it this way. When my eyes are closed, I open my eyes. Now, within the first nanosecond, the smallest fraction of time you can even imagine, or you cannot imagine, it's like the smallest fraction of time. For the first fraction of a moment, I'm seeing Brahman. Because Brahman is all that exists. But then that Brahman which I'm seeing the moment I open my eyes gets covered. Gets covered by names and forms. And these pre-existing ideas in my mind. I know that a certain shape, like an object with this shape, I say, oh, that's a chair. And it's not just the chair, because then I see it's a red color, and it's this shape of the chair. And there in my mind, maybe I have hundreds of other different chairs I have seen. So just looking at one object, not just the name or the form of that object come to my mind, but so many related ideas with that object come to my mind. Now, all these ideas cover that object. And that's why I'm not able to see Brahman anymore. I'm just seeing objects everywhere. Now, if I can somehow develop the ability to look at an object and take the name and form out of that object, then I'll be standing in front of Brahman. What it means in effect is that every moment that we have existed through eternity, we have been dealing only with Brahman. Because there is no one else. I am Brahman, I'm speaking with Brahman, I'm talking, I'm eating, just everything is Brahman. But all this time, this Brahman is covered. Covered by names and forms and ideas and concepts. Not just outside, even here. This Brahman is covered too, with this body, this mind, my idea that I'm a human being. So all of us are just kind of moving through life with completely wrong notions about ourselves and wrong notion about the world. And yet, at the functional level, at the relative level, things seem to be going fine. We just think, why do I even have to think that I am a spiritual being? Just knowing that I'm a human being, life seems to be going fine. If I feel hungry and I eat food, it satisfies my hunger. If I'm thirsty, if I drink water, it quenches my thirst. Everything functions as it should. What is the problem? Well, the problem is, as we have seen many times before, just this existential reality of identifying with perishable entities and all the characteristics connected with them becoming my own characteristics. So, mortality of the body makes me think of myself as a mortal being. The dysfunction of the body and mind somehow makes me feel I am dysfunctional. If there is pain in the body and mind, I'm the one who suffers. But really, if it's a pain in the body should have suffered. Why is it my suffering? Because I think this is me. And that is the reason thinking of myself as a human being, fulfilling as it might be in many respects, cannot be totally fulfilling. That It has its joys, but it also has its sorrows. And what any of us really want, we don't have any problem with joys, the more the merrier. But the problem is with pain and suffering. So can I have happiness, joy, fulfillment, but no pain, no suffering? Is it possible? And what the book says is, yes, it's possible. But it's not possible in the body and the mind. It's possible partially, but if I'm looking for a totally, then I can find that kind of an unending joy, unending bliss only in the infinite. It cannot be found in perishable entities. And that is what is meant by saying, merge this universe in Brahman. Sometimes in devotional practices, we might hear and read it in the books of Ramakrishna and the teachings of many devotional scriptures as well, that in a practice of meditation, merge the Guru into the Ishta. Ramakrishna says often that the Ishta, the chosen ideal, or God and Guru are not two different entities. What it means is this, that as Sri Ramakrishna says, it's Satchidananda alone, God alone, who comes to us in the form of the Guru. So when we are meditating on God. But because we have not yet met God, we haven't yet seen God, what we have seen is a more tangible presence in the form of our spiritual teachers. But then when we pray, when we meditate, we recognize that way, the appearance of the teacher is nothing but the way God has chosen to become tangible for me. So therefore, just as we merge the universe in Brahman, we have to merge the teacher in God, in our Ishta, in our chosen ideal. Recognizing that the Guru is only an appearance, but behind that, the reality is God. Reality is Satchidananda. Reality is my chosen ideal. Just as this universe is only an appearance, but behind it, the reality is Brahman. Just as the snake is only an appearance, but behind it, the reality is the rope. So remaining always absorbed. The word always is actually pretty important here. Sarvada in the original text. Because it's true that those of us who have a meditation practice, morning and evening, when we try to do our japa, we try to do our meditation, we are making an effort to remain absorbed in a higher identity, in a deeper identity. It may not necessarily always be that I am Atman or Brahman. Sometimes it could just be connecting ourselves with our Ishta, with our chosen ideal, whichever way comes naturally to us. It can come in the form of, for some, it could come in the form of, I'm a child of God, I'm a child of Mother, I'm a servant of God. There are many different ways we could relate. Philosophically, of course, I'm a part of the divine, and so on. There are not just one way of how to relate to the supreme reality. But when we try to do that at the time of meditation, what we are really doing is trying to do something not very different from this. We are trying to transcend our present material identity, so to speak, of just an identity connected with this body and mind, and trying to see the deeper layers of reality there. And the inner being within this, in devotional language, can be seen as in the form of a relationship with one's own chosen ideal. So, do not try to think that just because the way it is presented in this book, that, merge the universe in Brahman, I am the Atman, that's the only way to do it. So even when someone worshipping or praying to Mother, or Holy Mother, or Durga, or or to Shiva or Vishnu or Buddha or Jesus, whichever way we try to think of that Supreme Being, when I try to connect myself with that Supreme Ideal, I am trying to leave behind my present identity and try to go closer to my real identity. Now, we do that for a few minutes in the morning, we do that few minutes in the evening. But what the text wants us to do, and that's what non-duality in practice is always remaining absorbed in that awareness. Now that seems like, well, when am I going to do all my other things if I remain always absorbed that? And the answer to that is this. It's not really as impossible as it may look. If we kind of look at it this way, let's say that there is something that is bothering us. There is something that is bothering us for a long time. Now, and then all of us have things kind of weighing on our mind. That maybe there is some deadline to be met, certain things to be done, or certain, your taxes have to be, your returns have to be filed, and you're just thinking about it. Oh, I need to do it, and so on. So all of us may have these things weighing on our mind. Now, when something is weighing on our mind, we don't just sit in a corner saying, this is weighing on my mind, I can't do anything else. No, we don't do that. We go about doing the things that need to be done. We still eat, we still try to sleep, we still try to go to work, we still go shopping, we do things that needed to be done, while all the while that something is still weighing on my mind. Or a kind of a more painful example would be if I have a toothache and you call up the doctor's office and dentist says, well, I can see you next Tuesday. And there are still 5 more days to go. Then you say, well, then what am I going to do next 5 days? Well, you just can't be sitting there doing nothing. Nobody can do nothing. We always are doing something or the other. And we still then, if there is no other dentist who can see me earlier, I still go on doing the things I need to do, but I never ever forget the toothache that I'm having. Now, if these things are possible, we cannot say that it's impossible that I will always remain absorbed in my true identity and then won't be able to do anything else. That excuse doesn't work. It's possible to be doing everything and at the same time reminding myself. So when we say I'm a devotee, how strong or how deep is my devotee identity? When I say I'm a spiritual seeker, how deep is my identity as a spiritual seeker? Yes, sure, when I'm meditating, when I'm attending a lecture or a class at satsang, we might say, oh, now I'm in a place of worship, I'm a devotee, I'm a spiritual seeker. Yeah, sure. But even when I go shopping, I'm still a devotee. I don't stop being a spiritual seeker. When you go to see the ball game, when you go to see the Red Sox, yes, you are a fan, you are enjoying the game, but you don't stop being a spiritual seeker. It's not simply a human being watching a game, a human being shopping. It's a spiritual seeker who is shopping, a spiritual seeker who is gardening, a spiritual seeker who is cooking. So, can I find a way of keeping that identity not buried deep in my unconscious to come up only twice a day for a few minutes in the morning and few minutes in the evening, but somehow find a way for that identity to remain in my field of consciousness more and more often throughout the day. And that's, I mean, we kind of see it happening in a very, in secular matters. Oftentimes people have pictures of their family, of their children at their workspace or on their desk, because these are objects, these are people, these are things that are dear to your heart, and you always want to kind of look at it and you feel happy. So it's kind of affirming my relationship, with my connection with my family, with my friends, or those whoever are my dear to me. So similarly, can I find ways to affirm my spiritual identity? And we have to be very creative about this. I mean, some of the hints you'll find in books, but if the more imaginative we are in a constructive sort of way, it can be very helpful. As I've sometimes said, among the examples that are pretty common about this is like when you are driving, and of course there are lights on the way. There's a red light. You got to stop. And then what do? What do we do normally when you're stopping at a red light? Well, if there's some music or something else going on, maybe you just listen to it, or you look here and there. And sometimes if you're late, you get annoyed at that red light. Like, when will this turn green? But one way would be, if I can associate that red light with something connected with my spiritual life. Maybe if someone is a worshipper of the Devi, worshipper of Holy Mother, for instance, then maybe that red light might remind me of the bindi on the Devi's forehead. Or I can think of that as the eye, that God is looking at me. Red eyes. Red eyes. Okay. But still, or nowadays, because we are in winter, but we do get sun now and then. It's not as if the sun already disappeared. Today, we really didn't see much sun today. But if you're sitting by the window, or if you go out for a walk, and the sun has come up, it's a nice sunny morning or afternoon, and you have the sun falling on your arms. If you have a poetic bent of mind, you can think, well, it's the Lord's hands who are kind of caressing me. Again, and these are just kind of the thoughts that just come to mind. But if we can have these kind of associations of certain things that are happening on a daily basis in our life, that would be a way to remind ourselves of our identity. And as I said, we have to be very creative about it. But if we can do that, then remaining always absorbed in that awareness will become easier and easier. Yes, in the beginning, there will be times when we will forget. There will be times when we'll be so absorbed or so distracted by something we won't remember it. But without getting upset about that, kind of whenever we remember it, kind of bring the mind back. And one helpful way for those of us who have received a mantra from our teachers is to just repeat the mantra just once. It may not take even a fraction of a second. Just mentally, just repeat the mantra, and then you feel connected again. So that would be a way to somehow always remain absorbed in our spiritual identity. And when we start doing that, we'll see within a matter of, even you try that for 15 days or a month or two, you will see it's not as difficult as it appears. But we have to make an effort. If our mind has gotten accustomed to living and doing in a certain way, then to change that way needs some effort. We know even whatever habits we acquire, habit is not our first nature, it's just a second nature. And once we are accustomed to thinking in a certain way, doing in a certain way, then doing or thinking that way become easier, because certain kind of a groove is formed and we just follow the beaten track. But now when we decide to think something differently or do things differently, that becomes difficult. It's a little bit like when you go hiking and there's already a path. So walking along a path, it's easy because already the path has been made. But you decide, no, I'm not going to go by this beaten track. I'm going to make a way through these bushes and through this jungle to go in a different way. Well, then you need something to kind of clear the way. There could be obstructions on the way and you need to clear it. Much harder work. So when we have developed certain habits, to do those things is very easy because it's kind of a road that has been cleared. But when I want to create a new habit of thinking, a new habit of doing, then it needs extra effort. But once I create that new pathway, then it becomes easier. And that's why this practice of always remaining absorbed in my identity, in my spiritual identity, an identity that is closer to my spiritual ideal. In the beginning, there's a lot of struggle. But when I continue that struggle without giving up, with perseverance, with faith, with devotion, with sincerity, it becomes easier and easier and easier and easier. And then we see it was not so difficult to begin with. So we will stop here today. This was a very important verse, and we will see when we continue this section of how much important it is to not just think that I am the Atman, not just appreciate the idea that I am more than my body and mind, but to find a way to remain rooted in that identity, to absorb our whole being into that identity. And what are the kind of changes that will happen within us and outside us when we succeed in doing so. So these topics will be discussed as we go further in this text. So you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, feel free to ask.
Swamiji. Swamiji, we have so many deficiencies as material beings. Is there any one weakness that we should prioritize to address first? For example, to just remember our spiritual identity or something such as that?
But there have been so many weaknesses. Can give an example like what?
That I see, I strive for name and form. I'm looking for senses, the poison of the senses. So
yeah,
the list is endless. Is there
yeah,
anyone?
well, that's true. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, that's why it's important for us to know ourselves as we are. I'm not talking about the Atman or Brahman or anything. Just as human beings, who am I as a person? There are billions of people in the world. And every one of us is also unique in some way. We can see that even within our family or among the circles of our friends, we might share some common characteristics of the people we know, but we also know deep down there is something unique about me, that I have certain strengths, I have certain weaknesses, and there are people around me, they have their strengths and their weaknesses. But their strengths may be different from mine, their weaknesses may be different from mine. A lot of times I think we spend a lot more time analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of other people. But I think we can use that time more efficiently, more productively by looking at our own strengths and weaknesses. The reason we do it naturally about other people is because objective study is easier than subjective study. And because people are objects of our perception, it's easy for us to judge them. Like, this is good, this is bad, this shouldn't be like this shouldn't be like that. But we are not always able to do that as efficiently about our own selves. So to be a good judge is not simply who can judge others well, but who can judge themselves well. Now, in order for me to judge myself, I have to kind of objectify myself, because that's how all analysis, all examination works. There is an object. If I know what this is, how this is work, it has to be an object of my perception. But how can I become an object of my own self? How can I look at myself as a person the way I'm looking at other people as a person? And therefore, a little bit of the loosening of the ego is very important. So people who are very egoistic, it's difficult for them to examine themselves, because they're kind of so rooted deep inside. They can't come out of themselves to look and say, who is this person? And so in spiritual life, even before we think about God, before we think about anything, we need some kind of a way to look at ourselves and say, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And that's true with everyone. No one can say, I have only strengths and no weaknesses, or I have only weaknesses and no strength. That's not true. Every human being in this, I was about to say planet, but who knows, there may be beings everywhere. So, every living being will have some strengths and some weaknesses. Now, a good self-assessment would mean that as a person, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses. If I can do this well enough, even if it is not perfect, at least fairly, I can give my best shot at looking at me as just a person in this universe and saying, these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. Life becomes much easier after that, because then all I need to do is to make sure that my strength is preserved, because it can be lost. Neither my strengths nor my weaknesses are permanent. So, if I don't preserve my strength, if I don't cultivate it, if I don't develop it, it can be lost. And that's why people who, even physical strength for that matter, people who go to gym very regularly and do some weightlifting, and maybe then they say, oh, for one reason or the other, they stop doing it for a few years. If there is a gap, it's not like after a gap of 5 years, they go suddenly to a gym again and say, again, I'm going to lift it. No. Maybe they might be able to pick it up sooner than the first time, but they still would need to practice it again, because that ability, if it is not preserved, it can get lost. And that's true with not just physical strength. It could be mental, emotional, intellectual, at every level. So the decision making becomes easier. Should I do something or not? Should I think one way or not? And the way would be simply, will this help preserve my strength, or will it help remove at least one of my weaknesses? And if the answer is yes, then I should do it. I should think that way, I should do it that way. But if the answer is no, I shouldn't do it. Now, which of these weaknesses should I eliminate first? That will depend on the kind of weaknesses I find within me. It's not as if there are 10 weaknesses and I have to kind of remove them 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not like checking a box. Lot of times these are all connected, interconnected. It's almost like some of these aquatic creepers. You'll find a lot of these things in an aquarium or inside a small pond or something. Oftentimes you just kind of pull one, the others kind of get dragged on along with it. So even if we hold on to this one quality, one virtue, and say, I'm going to perfect myself in that quality, in that virtue, we might find that a lot of other connected virtues will automatically come along with it. And same is true with weaknesses also. It's not like just we cultivate only one weakness. No. Sometimes weaknesses are also interconnected. So if I can, for instance, people who have said, I'm just going to hold on to the virtue of truth. I'm going to be truthful. Then if I can do that as best I can, a lot of other qualities essential for spiritual life will come with just this one practice. So when someone says, oh, I'm just dishonest, but in all other ways I'm fine, or all other ways I'm fine, I just tell lies now and then. And it doesn't work that way. So, and yet in practice, it might be helpful to, once we are identified our strengths and weaknesses, to focus on any of these weaknesses and say, this is what I'm going to pay extra attention to going forward in my life. And we might find that if I can focus on doing something or not doing something and make that a priority or high up in my priority list, I will succeed in my attempt. In fact, in that little book called The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, a book that Swami Vivekachudamani carried with him everywhere during his wandering days. There were two books he carried. One was the Bhagavad Gita, and the other was this, The Imitation of Christ. In one place in that book, the author says, if I can eliminate even one weakness of mine per year, in 1 year, I just deal with one weakness, I might discover that very soon I will be a much better version of myself. I will go closer to the ideal. If I can even succeed in removing one weakness from my heart per year. And the reason I would imagine is that when I try to remove one weakness, a lot of other associated weaknesses will automatically kind of come to the surface and will become much easier eliminating them afterwards. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but the idea is to have a self-analysis, know our strengths or weaknesses, hold on to the strengths, and try to eliminate the weaknesses. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Swamiji, what, as a spiritual seeker, what I find very difficult to see myself as an Atman, because Atman is not an object or subject. So, but whatever study I go and learn, that everything is like snake and rope. Everything I have to see as the object.
As that?
As the object. So if Atman is beyond everything, how could I see myself? Nothing. In order to see myself as an Atman, which has no example or anything.
Yes, I mean, true, that is true. That's why the language that is used in books is to think that I am not simply the body, I am not simply the mind. And if I can even if I am not able to have any picture of who or what the Atman is, if I make an effort to not think of this as me, that, or at least I am more than simply this, that just as I live in a house, I am living inside the body, that the body is a covering, the mind is a covering. So the more I try to recognize my distinction from the body and mind, then gradually the idea or the reality of something beyond the material layers will go. So I'm never going to be able to see the Atman, because the Atman is an eternal subject. But it will become easier to hold on to that identity. So first, it is really kind of a neti. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind. Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, Anish.
So Swamiji, in that verse, it says always, but then it says absorbed, to remain always absorbed in the awareness. And so absorbed, it implies being, completely absorbed into the idea of the Brahman. So we take one step by trying to remember awareness all the time, and then as time goes on, become more and more absorbed in it. Is that the idea?
Yeah. The idea is that if I can do this for 5 seconds, it's not always, but at least for 5 seconds, then that's already very good. Because if I can remain absorbed in that identity for 5 seconds, I know, first of all, that it's possible to do so, because I wouldn't have been able to do even for 5 seconds if it were impossible. But if I can do it for 5 seconds, then it gives me hope. And maybe if I try harder, maybe after a little bit more practice, I might be able to remain absorbed in it for 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And that's what I need to do then. Let's keep on increasing that period. And when that becomes 24 hours, then I am enlightened for a day. And then if I can become 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, then I am enlightened forever. So, but the first trick is, can I do it for 2 seconds, even for a second? That's the thing. It's almost like planting a foot inside, even if it is for a second or a moment. Because if I can do it once, I can do it again. If I can do it for 1 second, I can do it for 2 seconds. And so getting that first foot inside, that first glimpse of absorption, that's one of the landmarks, so to speak, in our spiritual journey. That sometimes gets described also as the first genuine spiritual experience that we have. Now, spiritual experience is a very generic term. It can get described in many different ways, and our way of understanding what a spiritual experience is also can vary, because we are dealing with words and words are understood in different ways. But going for a more literal meaning of the word spiritual, as opposed to non-material, if in our practice of prayer or worship or meditation or japa, if there are moments when we have completely forgotten ourselves and not fallen asleep. I mean, there are two different things. Sometimes people fall asleep, they're drowsy, and say, oh, I didn't know anything. Well, that's not absorption, that's absorption in sleep. But sleep is a state of ignorance. Sleep is a state of tamas. So yes, not that absorption really. But if I'm alert, if I'm fully alert, and yet the senses have completely been withdrawn from the world outside, that would be an experience of absorption. When I'm completely vigilant, completely alert, and yet no sensory input at all. And that's possible. But once we kind of get that glimpse, even if it is for a fleeting second, it's a wonderful experience. And then that generates a lot of hope, a lot of faith that yes. And then in fact, it can be almost like a competition with yourself. You experience it once and then you don't know. It's not like, oh, after 5 minutes it will come again. Well, who knows? It can. There's no timetable for this. Maybe it comes the next day, maybe next week. Maybe it doesn't come for another year. Maybe it comes after 10 years. Maybe it comes after 50 years. Again, what I'm really saying is there is no way to know if you have once had that experience when it will come again. And that's why we have to be vigilant, because if I'm not vigilant, then it may come and I may not even notice it. I may be so busy with something else that I become impervious to that kind of a thing. And therefore, it's almost like, therefore spiritual life is not so much about competing with other people, it's competing with our own selves. I mean, competing with other people is very unhealthy. That creates some very bad, it's not helpful for spiritual life. But if I can compete with myself and say, oh yes, I had good meditation today and I felt good about it, I want to have the same type of meditation tomorrow. And maybe I succeed, maybe I don't. But then I can say, I'm going to just give my best shot. I'm not going to compromise at all. And so it's almost like a competition with oneself. And that's much healthy. That once you kind of get some experience and say, I want this experience to be repeated. And I'm going to. And then we will no longer then ask questions like, what is the minimum meditation I need to do? What's the minimum japa I need to do? No, there is nothing. Then all that I want to do is, I want to do it as much as I can, as often as I can, as intensely as I can, because I want that experience again. We see that in a much larger, much deeper scale in the life of Vivekananda. And that was, of course, we are just speaking about just a moment's absorption. So we are just in a kindergarten of spiritual life. In Vivekananda's case, we saw that he had that highest experience of non-duality, nirvikalpa samadhi. And then he goes to Ramakrishna's room. And Ramakrishna, of course, he knew already, he didn't need to be told what had happened. And then Sri Ramakrishna said, I'm going to lock up this experience you had as locking up inside, and said, you have a lot of mother's work to do. And I will unlock it when the mother's work is done. That was not something very like, oh, thank you for locking it up. No, he was not happy. It was such a wonderful experience. He wants it again. And so we read in his life, he tried so much because he has had that highest experience. He doesn't want to come out of it. He wants to remain in that one. And then we see, at least in 3 or 4 recorded experiences in Swamiji's life, when through Ramakrishna's grace, he had that experience. In fact, 3 of them in this country itself. One when he was at the Thousand Island Park. The other was when he was here in northern New Hampshire, in Camp Percy. And the third was in the shore of Lake Michigan. These are the recorded instances. So even for Vivekananda, that highest experience he had and how much we read in his life, while so much of his life gets described in terms of the lectures he gave in the Parliament of Religions and the kind of a public persona of Swamiji, what often doesn't get as much attention is the deep inner life, the mystical life, the inner thing that he wants to kind of get that experience again. And only a few days before his Mahasamadhi, when someone asked him, because Sri Ramakrishna had said that Narendranath, that was Vivekananda's name, he will refuse to live even for a moment once he knows who he truly is. And that's why Ramakrishna had actually locked up that realization, so to speak. And so because this incident was known among the circles to the direct disciples and others. So once one of the direct disciples asked him, half jokingly, said, Swamiji, do you now know who you are? And Swamiji very seriously says, yes, I know. Then we read in his life, there's complete silence. And then just in a matter of days, Swamiji voluntarily, he chose a day of then giving up his body. And so again, I mention all this to show that experiences can come. In Swamiji's case, it was the highest experience. In our case, we are just speaking about the first initial absorption. But in both cases, the experience itself always lasts for a short time. But then, the effect of that, the memory of that, the samskara of that experience remains deep inside. And because it's such a fulfilling, joyful experience, inevitably, we want to have it again. It's like you taste a good dish and you love it. Its taste is great. It leaves a good samskara and you say, I want to have more of it. Of course, who wouldn't want? So this spiritual experience is like that. It's so, there's just no words to describe it. And then once you get even a glimpse of it, no one then will have to ask us to do some more japa or do some more meditation. Without being told, without being pushed, we will do it on our own. And that's the beauty of it. So we'll stop here today. When we meet tomorrow, next week, we will start with verse 266. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. Next Sunday for satsang, our subject will be understanding Sharada Devi. Because the Sunday after that, on 18th of this month, we will celebrate Holy Mother's birthday puja. So preparation for that, this Sunday, we will reflect on her life and teachings. Next Wednesday, we will continue with this study, and Saturday we'll have meditation as usual. So we'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.